Nightfall Express, a thriller by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1. A Stormy Departure. The howl of the wind rattled the windows of the station as Gideon Drake stood on the platform, coat drawn tight against the biting November chill. Above him, the sign read, Edinburgh Waverley, its letters faintly illuminated by a flickering overhead light. The Nightfall Express stretched before him, its carriages gleaming with an air of vintage charm that contrasted starkly with the modern station around it. At 67, Gideon wasn't sure if he had the patience for a journey like this. The days of covert operations and intelligence work were behind him, but his daughter's persistent invitations had finally worn him down. A weekend in Sevenoaks, Kent, seemed like a welcome escape from the monotony of his post-retirement life. The train's whistle pierced the night, drawing Gideon's attention back to the present. He adjusted his grip on his leather bag and stepped aboard. Inside, the warm glow of lamps cast long shadows on the walls, and the faint scent of polished wood and worn upholstery filled the air. As he navigated the narrow corridor to his cabin, Gideon observed the other passengers. A wiry man with close-cropped hair sat in the lounge car, nervously drumming his fingers on the table. His sharp eyes darted toward the exit, as though expecting someone. A few seats away, a middle-aged woman flipped through a worn copy of The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, scribbling notes in the margins.
Vivienne, she introduced herself when she caught Gideon's glance. History teacher, you?
Gideon Drake, he replied, visiting family.
She nodded, seemingly satisfied. He filed away the interaction, trained instincts alerting him to subtle details, Vivienne's quick assessment of him, the nervous energy of the man in the suit. Old habits died hard. The train jolted into motion, rain streaking against the windows as it left Edinburgh behind. Gideon leaned back in his cabin's armchair, letting the rhythmic clatter of the train lull his restless thoughts. It didn't last. A sudden knock at his door snapped him upright. Sliding it open, he found Gavin, the train guard, standing in the corridor.
Everything all right, sir? Gavin asked, his voice low.
Fine, Gideon replied, studying the young man's face.
But even as Gavin left, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Chapter 2. The First Disappearance. The storm intensified as the train rumbled southward. The warm glow of the carriages should have been comforting, but Gideon sensed an undercurrent of tension among the passengers. After an hour of watching the countryside blur by, he decided to stretch his legs. The lounge car was busier now. Vivienne was still engrossed in her book, though she seemed to be watching people over the rim of her glasses. The nervous man in the suit had moved to a corner table, his tea untouched, his grip tight around the cup. Then the train jolted violently, throwing passengers off balance. The lights flickered, and for a moment the car was plunged into near darkness. When they stabilized, Gideon scanned the room. The nervous man was gone.
Where did he go? Gideon asked aloud.
Vivienne looked up. Who?
The man in the suit, Gideon insisted. He was right there.
Manuel, the Bulgarian bartender, frowned.
Not that I saw.
Gideon felt a chill, not from fear, but from something else, deception. He rose from his seat and walked the length of the train. The corridors were quiet, sleeper cabins shut. At the end of the car, he found something wedged into the doorframe, a crumpled piece of paper. Unfolding it, he read the jagged scrawl. It didn't have to be this way. Gideon pocketed the note. Something was very wrong. Chapter 3. A Growing Conspiracy. Gideon couldn't shake the message. It was a warning, or worse, evidence of foul play. He needed information.
Vivienne watched him closely as he returned. Find what you were looking for.
Not yet,
Gideon replied, taking a seat across from her.
Did you really see someone sitting there?
You don't believe me?
It's just strange. One moment you say he's here, the next he's gone. And no one else remembers him.
Before Gideon could respond, Gavin entered the car, his uniform slightly rumpled.
Apologies for the disruption earlier,
He announced.
Just some technical issues due to the storm.
Gideon studied him.
What kind of issues? Radio's intermittent, but nothing to worry about.
Gideon didn't buy it. The tension in Gavin's voice told him there was more to the story. Then the train jolted again. The lights flickered, and the car went silent. When the lights returned, another passenger was gone. Chapter 4. The Cover-Up. Enough.
Gideon muttered under his breath. He had seen disappearances before, in the field when people were removed. This was no accident.
This is coordinated.
Agreed.
Gideon's mind raced.
Either someone is abducting passengers, or the train itself is a target.
They hurried toward the sleeper cabins. Gideon checked each one. Most were locked. When they reached cabin 12, the door was ajar. Inside, the bed was unmade, blankets tossed aside. On the floor near the nightstand was another note. It didn't have to be this way. Then Gideon saw it, a dark stain near the door. Blood.
We need to talk to the crew. Now.
They made their way back to the lounge, only to find Gavin missing. Manuel stood behind the counter, his expression grim.
Something is wrong.
Manuel said quietly.
People are vanishing.
And I think someone on this train is making sure it stays that way.
Chapter 5, the chase begins. With Gavin missing, Gideon and Vivienne had no choice but to take matters into their own hands. They searched the train systematically, finding no sign of Gavin or the missing passengers. Then, near the rear carriage, they heard a muffled voice.
Gideon motioned for silence. Slowly, he crept toward the source. A small maintenance hatch stood slightly open. Inside, the voice grew clearer, panicked, desperate.
Let me out.
Gideon yanked open the hatch. Inside, bound and gagged, was Gavin.
What the hell is going on?
Vivienne's eyes widened.
Gideon pulled the gag free. Who did this?
Gavin gasped for air.
We have to stop the train now.
Gideon's gut clenched. This was bigger than he'd thought, and they were running out of time. Chapter 6, the interrogation. Gideon shut the maintenance hatch behind them and locked it. Gavin sat on the floor, catching his breath, while Vivienne scanned the corridor.
Who did this to you?
Gideon asked, crouching in front of the guard. Gavin's face was pale, his lips split.
2 men. Didn't recognize them. They wore uniforms, but not from this train.
Vivienne frowned.
Posters?
They knew what they were doing.
Gideon's jaw clenched.
They kept asking about a package.
Gavin continued.
Something they thought I had.
Vivienne and Gideon exchanged a glance.
There's something on this train they want?
Gideon murmured.
Something worth abducting passengers for.
Gavin nodded.
They said if I interfered, I'd disappear too.
Gideon stood.
Then we need to find them first.
They moved quickly, retracing their steps, keeping to the shadows. When they reached the dining car, Gideon spotted a pair of unfamiliar men near the rear exit, speaking in hushed tones. One of them had a gun.
We need a plan.
Vivienne whispered. Gideon nodded. They had 2 options. Confront them now, or find the package before they did.
Do you know what they're after?
He looked back at Gavin. Gavin hesitated before nodding.
I think I do.
Gideon's eyes narrowed.
Then lead the way.
The chase was on. Chapter 7, the final warning. Gavin, still catching his breath, led Gideon and Vivienne down the narrow corridor, glancing behind him every few steps. His hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his brow.
The package,
He whispered.
is in the storage compartment near the rear.
Vivienne narrowed her eyes.
What's in it?
Gavin swallowed hard.
Classified documents. Sensitive enough that someone's willing to kill for them.
Gideon's instincts screamed that they were running out of time. The storm outside roared against the train, masking their hurried footsteps as they approached the rear carriage. They reached the storage area, and Gavin fumbled with the key, unlocking the compartment. Inside, a steel briefcase rested on a shelf. The moment Gavin lifted it, a single chime echoed through the corridor. A tripwire alarm.
Move.
Gideon barked, grabbing Vivienne and Gavin as gunfire erupted down the hall. Bullets tore through the wooden panels as they ducked into a side cabin. Breathless. We're exposed. Vivienne muttered, checking her watch.
Next stop is in 15 minutes.
Gideon peeked into the hallway. Shadows moved in the dim light. Their attackers were closing in.
Then we hold the line?
He said, gripping a fire extinguisher.
Or we don't make it off this train alive.
The final confrontation had begun. Chapter 8, the escape plan. Gunfire tore through the wooden panels of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Gideon pressed against the doorframe, his breath steady despite the chaos. He motioned for Vivienne and Gavin to stay low. Their attackers were closing in fast.
We can't stay here.
Vivienne hissed.
They'll corner us.
Gideon glanced toward the window. The train hurtled through the storm, rain streaking the glass. Jumping was suicide. That left only one option.
The dining car?
He murmured.
It has multiple exits.
Gavin clutched the briefcase to his chest.
We won't make it if they pin us down. Then we move fast.
Gideon gripped the fire extinguisher, waiting for the next round of shots. When the gunfire paused, he flung open the door, hurling the extinguisher into the corridor. It crashed against the floor, releasing a blinding cloud of white mist.
Go.
They sprinted down the hallway, Past shuttered cabins, their footsteps drowned out by the storm. Shadows flickered in the fog as their pursuers struggled for visibility. Gideon slammed the door to the dining car behind them, locking it. Manuel, the bartender, looked up from polishing a glass.
What the hell is going on?
No time to explain?
Gideon panted.
We need the emergency hatch.
Manuel gestured toward the kitchen.
Through there leads to the storage hold.
They pushed through the doors into the dimly lit storage area. Crates of supplies rattled as the train swayed. At the far end, a metal hatch marked emergency exit gleamed under the fluorescent light.
Vivienne turned the handle, locked.
Gavin, can you open it?
The young guard set the briefcase down and fished out a keyring. His fingers fumbled under pressure. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor.
They're coming.
Vivienne warned. The lock clicked. Gavin swung the hatch open, revealing the rushing landscape below. The wind roared, deafening.
No way.
Gavin protested.
We can't jump.
Gideon's mind raced. There had to be another way. He scanned the storage hold and spotted a maintenance ladder bolted to the side of the train. It led downward, toward the wheels. He said,
Stay low, hold on tight.
Vivienne went first, descending carefully into the wind-whipped darkness. Gavin followed, clutching the briefcase. Gideon brought up their arm, pausing just as the storage doors burst open. A masked gunman stepped inside, weapon raised. Gideon didn't hesitate. He swung the hatch closed and kicked it, sealing himself outside. Rain lashed against his face as he grabbed the ladder, feet slipping. The train barreled forward into the night, carrying them toward the unknown. The chase wasn't over yet. Chapter 9, A Desperate Gamble. The wind howled around them as Gideon, Vivienne, and Gavin clung to the rungs of the maintenance ladder. The speeding train rattled beneath their feet, every gust of wind threatening to tear them off the side.
We can't stay out here forever.
Gavin shouted over the roar of the storm. Gideon scanned the train, his mind racing. If they climbed back up, they'd walk straight into the gunman. Their only option was to keep moving.
There's another access hatch further down,
He called.
We climb.
Vivienne adjusted her grip and began moving sideways along the narrow ledge, rain blinding her. Gavin hesitated before following, keeping a tight hold on the briefcase. Gideon brought up the rear, his every muscle straining against the wind. Behind them, the storage door burst open. A masked attacker leaned out, aiming a pistol at their retreating forms.
Move.
Gideon shouted as a shot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the metal frame, inches from Vivienne's hand. She flinched, but kept going. Another shot. This time, the gunman adjusted his aim. Gideon didn't hesitate. He released one hand from the ladder, swung his body sideways, and kicked the gunman square in the chest. The man stumbled backward, losing his grip, and disappeared into the darkness below. Gavin swallowed hard.
That was close.
Too close?
Gideon muttered, hauling himself forward.
We need to move now.
They reached the emergency hatch and Gavin fumbled with the lock. More footsteps echoed above. The attackers were coming.
Hurry up.
Vivienne urged. The latch gave way and they tumbled inside, landing in a dimly lit utility compartment. Steam hissed from pipes along the walls, and the rhythmic pounding of the train's wheels filled the space.
That won't hold them for long.
Gideon locked the hatch behind them.
We have to reach the front of the train.
Vivienne wiped rain from her face.
If we can get to the driver's cabin, we might be able to stop this thing.
Gavin nodded.
Then let's go.
Gideon's jaw tightened. They hurried down the narrow corridor, the hum of the train's engines growing louder. The stakes had never been higher, and time was running out. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The corridor was eerily silent, as Gideon, Vivienne, and Gavin pressed forward toward the front of the train. Their soaked clothes clung to their skin, the adrenaline coursing through their veins, keeping them moving despite the exhaustion.
They'll expect us to head for the driver's cabin.
Gideon muttered.
We need a distraction.
Vivienne nodded and gestured to a luggage cart against the wall.
We send this rolling down the corridor, make them think we're coming from another direction.
Gideon gave a quick nod, and together they shoved the cart forward. It clattered noisily, picking up speed as it raced toward the far end. Seconds later, gunfire erupted, echoing off the narrow walls.
They took the bait.
Gavin whispered.
Now's our chance.
They moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows. As they approached the driver's cabin, Gideon peered inside through the small glass window. The train conductor lay unconscious on the floor, his hands tied. Two armed men stood nearby, one of them gripping the train's controls. Gideon took a deep breath, signaled to Vivienne and Gavin, then kicked the door open. The element of surprise was on their side. Gideon lunged at the nearest gunman, grabbing his wrist and twisting the weapon away. The man howled in pain as the gun clattered to the floor. Vivienne wasted no time, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall and slamming it into the second man's head. He crumpled to the ground, dazed but not out. Gavin rushed to the conductor, untying his hands.
Are you all right?
The conductor coughed, rubbing his wrists. They were trying to derail the train. Kill everyone on board. Gideon didn't hesitate. He turned to the controls, scanning the dials. The speed was dangerously high. If they didn't act fast, the train would derail within minutes.
Can you slow it down?
Vivienne asked. Gideon gritted his teeth, gripping the lever.
I can try.
Just then, the dazed gunman groaned and reached for his weapon. Before he could react, Gavin stepped forward and landed a solid punch to his jaw, knocking him out cold.
That's for tying me up?
He muttered. Gideon pulled the emergency brake. The train lurched violently, sending them all stumbling. Outside, the storm raged, but the train's speed gradually decreased. The screeching of metal against metal filled the air as the wheels fought against the sudden halt. Then, silence. The Nightfall Express had stopped. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was their heavy breathing.
We did it?
Vivienne whispered, disbelief in her voice. Gideon straightened, wiping sweat and rain from his brow.
For now.
Red and blue lights flashed outside as law enforcement swarmed the train. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn, securing the scene. The nightmare was finally over. As they stepped off the train onto solid ground, Gideon looked back at the Nightfall Express. What had started as a quiet journey had turned into a battle for survival.
Think you'll take another train ride anytime soon?
Vivienne nudged him. Gideon exhaled a tired chuckle.
Only if you're buying the tickets.
The three of them walked toward the waiting police, ready to explain everything. The Nightfall Express had reached its final destination, and the secrets it carried would soon be revealed. But Gideon had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time trouble found him on the rails. Epilogue, a new journey. The Nightfall Express sat still on the tracks, its sleek frame illuminated by flashing red and blue lights. Investigators combed through the carriages, cataloguing evidence, while passengers were escorted to waiting buses and hotels. The chaos had finally subsided, but for Gideon, the adrenaline still lingered. Standing near the platform, he watched as Vivienne spoke with a detective, recounting the night's harrowing events. Gavin stood a few feet away, a blanket draped over his shoulders, sipping a steaming cup of tea as he answered an officer's questions.
You handled yourself well,
Gideon said as he approached the young guard. Gavin gave a weary smile.
Didn't feel like it, but thanks.
Vivienne walked over, shaking her head.
It'll take weeks for them to piece this all together. The authorities are still trying to determine who was behind it all.
They'll find answers eventually, but I doubt we'll ever know the full story.
Gideon exhaled.
And what about you? Back to retirement.
Gideon chuckled dryly.
Somehow I don't think so. I was starting to enjoy the quiet, but, well, I suppose trouble has a way of finding me.
She smirked.
Maybe next time we take a plane.
Gavin raised his cup.
Or a boat?
Gideon looked back at the Nightfall Express, the train that had nearly cost them their lives. It was supposed to be a simple trip, but it had turned into something far more dangerous.
Let's just agree no more trains for a while,
he said, turning to Vivienne and Gavin with a knowing smile. With that, they stepped away from the chaos, walking into the first rays of dawn, ready to face whatever came next. The journey was over. For now.